As you know, I'm obsessed with Dream of the Red Chamber. It's an absolutely fantastic novel, even if you know nothing about its history. But the more that you know about its historical context, the more fascinating the novel is. In particular, the author makes numerous references to the old world of Chinese romantic fiction. These are references that can be easy to miss if you don't know something about them. And that's why it's kind of funny to see a bunch of Western scholars who read this book miss the point completely. You see, there's this idea out there that Dream of the Red Chamber is some sort of high literature. Now, I guess that's true. There's a lot of deep philosophic ideas in the book, a lot of elements that quote other books, other parts of literature, and so on and so forth. But the truth is that a lot of its content makes sense only if you understand the full extent of the literary world in which it was written. I'll show you why. Now, the first thing to understand is that China experienced a huge increase in literacy at the beginning of the 16th century. As the Cambridge History of Chinese Literature notes here, there is a ton of evidence of a generally literate public during the middle and late period of the Ming Dynasty. This is about 150 years or so before Cao Shuiqin was deeply immersed in writing Dream of the Red Chamber. That's assuming he is indeed the author, of course. Now, the emergence of printing of popular works also meant illustrations in vivid color and text, something that we also saw in Europe not long after Gutenberg, right around the same time. Now, the rise in general literacy caused the start of numerous literary societies, something that also happens within the world of Dream of the Red Chamber. In fact, the more that you understand about that literary world of the late Ming Dynasty and early Qing Dynasty, the more that you will realize that Dream of the Red Chamber is a microcosm of what intellectual life was really like in China at that time. We're talking about between the late 16th century and around the mid 18th century when the book was written. And that helps explain a lot of the more confusing literary references that you find in the book. Take the famous poems of Chapter 5 for an example. These can be really hard to work through and are presented in a really awkward manner. The most challenging part for the reader is that they refer to characters that mostly haven't even been introduced yet. Now, if you look at the history of poetry during the time, the abundance of great poetry in Dream of the Red Chamber starts to make a little bit more sense. Again, as the Cambridge History shows us, the compiled complete Tang poems consisted of about 48,000 poems, which is a lot. But the complete Ming Dynasty poems, which are still being compiled, comes to over 400,000 individual entries, which is mind-boggling. When the author of Dream of the Red Chamber was carefully composing his poetry over a century after the fall of the Ming Dynasty, he had a ton of poetic works to choose from. And then there's that issue of gender. Now, this comes up time and time again in this book. In fact, you can't read the book without running into the issue of gender. Lin Dayu, of course, is the famous poetess and is clearly more talented and skilled at the craft than anybody else in the book. But the other 12 beauties of Jinling, the other women, also have fantastic poetic abilities. In fact, every single one of them beats the pants off of hacks like Jia Yucun, whose poems are laughable at best. You might wonder why the author of Dream of the Red Chamber portrays women as being so heavily literate. After all, many of us, especially in the West, were taught to believe that Chinese women in this period were purposely forced to be illiterate. But the truth is that things weren't really like that. In particular, the rise of printing in the later years of the Ming Dynasty gave way to huge increases in the number of literate women. In turn, that led to guides to proper female behavior, something that is mentioned specifically in Dream of the Red Chamber. And so you had works like this, the 4 classics for women, which were filled with supposedly inspiring stories of brutal self-sacrifice. The combination of a rising group of literate women and the ridiculous restrictions they were living under created massive social contradictions. And those contradictions are personified in Li Wan, a female figure in Dream of the Red Chamber whose brilliance is oppressed for her entire life. Now, to be clear, this type of social commentary wasn't necessarily common in those works at the time, especially works of popular literature. It's just like how in genre fiction today, you usually are not going to find a bunch of authors who are going to throw a whole bunch of, like political or social commentary into their work, or even embed it inside. Most people don't want to buy it, they don't want to read it. Now, you can find obvious social criticism in books like Jinping Mei or The Plum and the Golden Vase, and in other books like Rulin Wai Shi or The Scholars. But nowhere is it as apparent and as deep as in Dream of the Red Chamber. But the thing is that social criticism in Dream of the Red Chamber is woven in the middle of a fascinating love story that pays homage to all sorts of the popular literary tropes of the time. The later period of the Ming Dynasty saw a huge explosion in popular theater works in China. Most famous of these is probably Mudanting, or the Peony Pavilion. That play revolves around the romance between a teenage girl named Du Linyang and a young scholar she meets in a dream. Tragically, she dies before ever meeting the man that she saw in her dreams. However, through the magic of the stage, she is resurrected after her would-be lover comes around looking for her. That lover, Liu Mengmei, winds up narrowly escaping death by passing the imperial examinations. This is a triumph that ensures that everybody lives happily ever after. Now that might sound like a somewhat odd storyline to you. I mean, it does to me. But the truth is that passing the imperial examinations was a common trope in Chinese fiction during that time. That's what would make you win in life. That's what would make everything better. And this concept is all over Dream of the Red Chamber. Early in the first chapter of Dream of the Red Chamber, the author makes direct critical references to the tropes of romantic fiction of his day, referred to here as 才子佳人. These are books about Zhou Wenjun and Cao Zijian, two well-known poets from the past whose lives formed the basis of a lot of the romantic literature of the day. The 才子佳人 genre of fiction, of course, was filled with love stories in which the protagonist would save the day and win the woman by passing the imperial examinations. And there are tons of these books out there. But you don't need to be an expert in obscure Chinese romantic literature from the 17th century to understand what the author's aiming at. You see, modern romance books, like the ones that you might like to read, they're full of all these tropes, and they're exactly the same. This is obvious if you read those classic books on advice for writing in modern literary genres, like How to Write Romance Novels That Sell. This checklist right at the beginning itself is a great way to analyze Dream of the Red Chamber, and while I'm going to skip through some of these, note that they all apply. The boy needs to be above the girl socially, and he needs to be rich. Lin Daiyu is an orphan girl from a humble background. Jia Baoyu, meanwhile, is filthy rich. Daiyu is absolutely alone in the world. In fact, her superpower is her ability to cry. Daiyu absolutely wants love and wants to belong. Meanwhile, there are lots of questions about what Jia Baoyu really wants in life. And Jia Baoyu's various indiscretions make the reader wonder if he really is different from the other men in his household. Now, we haven't quite gotten to this part yet, but the moment of danger absolutely does come, and it makes the obvious romance between the two even deeper. And there is a very significant last-minute plot twist, almost as if the author of Dream of the Red Chamber wrote this work. But then you've got the final point, the one that sadly does not apply to Dream of the Red Chamber. You see, Dream of the Red Chamber at heart is a romance book, but there's a problem. It breaks the cardinal rule of romance fiction. That rule is that you're supposed to have a happily ever after ending, or at least a happily for now ending. This book doesn't have that. It has a sad ending. Romance books are not supposed to have sad endings. If you write a romance novel and you have a sad ending, the reviewers will review bomb your book and will make sure that nobody ever buys another book that you ever write ever again. This was as true in China in the 17th century as it is today. Anyway, there are other fascinating connections between Dream of the Red Chamber and the literature of its time. For example, many of the Ming Dynasty plays involve fetishizing a specific object. This was usually something small and insignificant. In Dream of the Red Chamber, Jia Baoyu's piece of jade is that object, and the great climax of the book involves that bizarre piece of jade. Anyway, there's more that I could say about this here, but we'll talk about this in later videos. Long story short though, although Dream of the Red Chamber probably should be thought of as high literature, the best way to understand it is by understanding the full world of Chinese literature at its time. In other words, you cannot just read a whole bunch of highfalutin philosophy books and have this book make sense. You need to understand how romance works. That means you need to understand the tropes of romance fiction, including the tropes of that fictional genre today. That includes low romance or cheap romance, whatever it is you want to call it. Go read Danielle Steele and then read Cao Shuiqin and you'll start understanding what he's doing and what he's saying. Fortunately for us, those tropes of romance have not changed. They've not changed with the passage of time, and we're talking several centuries. They've not changed across continents. I'm in the United States, not in China. They've not changed across different cultural climates. They remain the same. Dream of the Red Chamber is basically the ultimate anti-romance novel, and that's what makes it so fascinating and so addictive to this day.